Good morning. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Bob Holsworth. Hopefully he will enlighten all of us as to the continuing election results. Dr. Holsworth is one of the leading political analysts in Virginia. His comments on Virginia and national politics have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and newspapers throughout the nation. He has appeared on almost all the major American television networks and on the BBC. Bob is also the regular political analyst for WTVR in Richmond. As the author of 5 books and numerous articles on public policy and American politics, he was the founding director of both the Center for Public Policy and the Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at VCU. Bob is currently a managing principal in Decide Smart, a firm that provides analysis and planning assistance to agencies, local governments, nonprofits, and private sector companies with governmental interests. Bob received his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Holsworth.
Thanks very much. It's great to be with the 901 other people here. And, we're talking about the second year in a row where we had an election that were no surprises, entirely predictable, and the like. I think it confirmed there was a 19th century philosopher who said the owl of wisdom flies only at dusk. And I think that's what pollsters and pundits should take heart to these days, because that's likely what happened here. So let me try to explain, for the best I can, what happened and why, and what some of the implications may well be. And I guess the one way I wanted to start this is by looking back 20 years ago, the gubernatorial election 20 years ago, which this is the anniversary of the no car tax election in 1997 when Jim Gilmore became governor, 20 years ago. And here were the 3 localities, the 3 jurisdictions where the Republicans had their highest margins of votes in 1997. Number 1 was Chesterfield County. Number 2 was Virginia Beach. And number 3 was Henrico County. All 3 suburban jurisdictions, 2 around the Richmond area, 1 in Hampton Roads. That's where Republicans did best. Now if we go 20 years fast forward, and we take a look at the 10 largest jurisdictions in terms of votes, this is what happened 20 years later in Virginia. And I hope I don't have a Rick Perry moment that I can get to 10. Number 1 was Fairfax County. 147,000 vote margin for Ralph Northam. Number 2 was Virginia Beach. 6,000 vote margin for Ralph Northam. Number 3 was Prince William County, 29,000 vote margin for Ralph Northam. Number 4 was Loudoun County, 23,000 vote margin for Ralph Northam. Number 5 was Chesterfield County, 6,000 vote margin for Ralph Northam. Number 6 was Henrico County, 26,000 vote margin for Ralph Northam. Number 7 was Arlington, People's Republic. 52,000 vote margin for Ralph Northam. Number 8 was the city of Richmond, 46,000 vote margin for Ralph Northam. Number 9 was Chesapeake, 3,000 vote margin for Ralph Northam. And number 10 was Norfolk, and I think that was about 30,000 vote margin for Ralph Northam. So if you take a look at the 10 largest jurisdictions in Virginia, they all went for Ralph Northam and the Democrats in 2017. What a dramatic change. Here is where the Republicans did best, right? And there's a couple of people who've heard this, so I won't ask the question because I've been offering a bottle of wine to anybody who could tell me the 3 jurisdictions where Republicans got their largest margins of votes. Here they were. Bedford County, number 1. Hanover County, number 2. Augusta County, number 3. That's the Republican base in Virginia right now in statewide elections. So that's the change, the dramatic change that we have seen over time. And so if I had to sum that up, just sort of geographically, here's what I've seen over 35 years in Virginia. When I first started watching Virginia politics, rural Virginia was really half Democratic, half Republican. Conservative Democrats, but they were Democrats. But if you look at rural Virginia now, it is very difficult to find a Democrat in the General Assembly who's really a rural Virginian representing rural districts. Creed Deeds in the Senate, but he represents Albemarle and Charlottesville. I think maybe Rosalind Tyler might be the closest in Southside there in the House. But for the most part, rural Virginia has gone completely red politically there. And it did so in this election. And in fact, Ed Gillespie ran up a margin that was a little higher than Republicans had been running up in most of rural Virginia. So rural Virginia has become kind of red over time. That's a big change. Urban Virginia was Democratic when I first started looking at Virginia politics, and it's Democratic today. And in fact, those folks came out in large numbers, the urban Virginians, in this election. Democrats had a slightly higher turnout, or considerably higher turnout than in 2013. In the city of Richmond, there were 58,000 votes in 2013, 71,000 votes in 2017 in a city that was 80% Democratic. So that's kind of stayed the same. But the change is these suburban districts that we mentioned. Chesterfield County has gone from being the place where Republicans got their largest margin to a purple county, essentially. I think it still leans a little red, but by and large it has now become competitive. Henrico has gone from 13,000 vote Republican margin to a county that's entirely blue in terms of statewide elections. Virginia Beach, kind of like Chesterfield, was Republican, but not by as much any longer. And so that tells you the sort of the big change that's occurred in Virginia are these sort of suburban jurisdictions. So how did all this play out in the election, and why has it played out this way? So on one hand, I think there's been a demographic change in these suburbs, where the Democrats have done far better with the population that's moved into the suburbs, whether they're people from out of state, whether they're people, we have far more ethnic diversity in the suburbs. Chesterfield County was 75% white in 2000, 67% in 2010, probably ticking down a little bit. And the Democrats have done far better with Latinos, with Asian Americans, and they also did extraordinarily better with sort of younger Virginians in this election as well as getting 61% of women. But what you've seen in these suburbs is a demographic change in which the Democrats have been more successful than the Republicans in responding to that. And we've seen that happen too. Second thing that happened in this election, I believe, is there was a Trump effect that was huge and that nobody saw, that nobody particularly saw it among women. That what happened in this election is that any number of people came in on the Democratic side to vote for Ralph Northam and then just knocked out anybody who had an R next to their name. John O'Bannon, Rick Anderson, people who are well known as sort of wonderful public servants, really didn't tick off anybody in their community, just happened to have the wrong party next to their name in this election because I think a lot of people came out and mobilized against Trump. Typically, in the last couple of Virginia gubernatorial elections, there's been a 43% turnout. This election was almost 48%. It increased everywhere, actually, but it increased the largest in places where Democrats did best. And my sense is that had a Trump effect. Thirdly, I think you have to look at some of the campaigns. A lot of people who watched the campaign didn't think at first that Ralph Northam ran a great campaign because it was more biographical than issue-oriented. There wasn't a clear issue position that he took that distinguished himself all the time from Ed Gillespie and others. But by and large, it turned out to be sort of a perfect campaign for the Times because in all his commercials, what did he tell you he was? He was a doctor. He was a physician. And that he contrasted that to Ed Gillespie's background as a lobbyist. And if you had to make a choice, physician or lobbyist, where were you? And then secondly, it was an implicit contrast with the president. That Ralph Northam was somebody who cared, somebody who was going to bring people together, somebody who had worked on everybody's behalf, and that turned out to be a very compelling message. Well, Ed Gillespie had a real challenge. How is he going to deal with this situation of Donald Trump? What was he going to do? I recall 30 years ago when Doug Wilder ran for governor, there had been a sort of a Democrat who was somewhat of a lightning rod at the time who had just run for president twice. Hadn't won, but it was Jesse Jackson. And in fact, he had carried Virginia in the Democratic primary. And Jackson said to Wilder, Doug, I will do anything you want. Please tell me what to do. And he said, well, Jesse, you can do anything you want, so long as it's not in Virginia. Yeah. And in fact, he kept everybody out of Virginia. Didn't want any, it wasn't Jackson specific, it was just he didn't want these national people. So Gillespie had this problem. What would he do? And you might recall when he came here last year and gave a talk at lunchtime to this event, he emphasized economic matters. It was bread and butter issues, how the state could be more competitive in those matters. But what happened is that by the end of that campaign, that had shifted, that message had shifted. And if you looked at the television, he was trying to, what I call Trumpism without Trump. Without bringing Donald Trump in, he embraced a lot of his issues, and that didn't work either. And I think in part, the challenge was that he was always going to have some trouble with the economic message because Virginia was improving. Virginia was doing better, unemployment was down, people saw the state moving forward a little bit, and my sense was that that was ultimately very problematic for Ed Gillespie to try to find a way to change the natural course of Virginia right now in statewide elections, which leans a little blue. And that's going to be the challenge for Republicans now, is how do they actually recover and begin to recapture the suburbs in statewide elections? How do they do what Bob McDonnell did 8 years ago? How is that going to happen? That's their biggest challenge. The Democrats, I think, on the other hand, while it's not costing them electorally, I don't think it's great for the state that at least in these statewide elections, even if we're competitive, we have these one-party regions where the Democrats aren't even present in rural Virginia. So that, to me, is their challenge. So as we saw in this election, my sense was that state, since 2005, in elections for governor, senator, and president, Bob McDonnell is the only Republican who won. So in statewide elections, we're trending blue, and given the Trump effect, it made almost an impossible environment for a Republican candidate this year. And the Democrats came up with a consensus candidate who certainly, in terms of his biography and presentation, Virginians became very comfortable with. The huge change in this election, of course, occurs in the Assembly. Who would have thought that 15 Democratic legislators, 15 Republican seats, they would lose 15 seats? It's almost unheard of in recent times to see that kind of change. I remarked a few years ago after one General Assembly election that there was more turnover in the Powhatan Board of Supervisors than the Virginia General Assembly. You might recall, just in 2015, Governor McCall spent how much money trying to change one seat? I don't know why he wanted to change Senator Norman's position, but he spent millions of dollars trying to do that. And at the end, nothing happened. Everything remained exactly the same. This time, something really different occurred. Candidates won who the Democratic Party didn't even support. In Prince William, there was a 30-year-old socialist, got into the campaign because he was working on a lighting job, and he got harmed by the current, and he got mad at VEC, the Employment Commission, because he had trouble getting workers' compensation. Ran, the Democratic Party didn't support him, ran against the House Majority Whip, a former student of mine, and won by 8 points. And so that's what you saw across Virginia. There were 6 or 7 Democratic candidates who won who didn't get supported by the Democratic Party because the party had limited resources, was putting resources in where they thought they could win, and wound up winning all throughout Northern Virginia and in the Richmond metropolitan area and in Hampton Roads. They won a number of places. So that was simply dramatic. All 15 of those candidates, I might add, or the vast majority of them, ran on fairness, civil rights, human rights platforms. Right? So that's going to be a different group, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So where are we right now? Right now, 21-19 in the Senate, 51-49 in the House, with still some degree of uncertainty about what that outcome really will be. Will any of Senator Norman's friends in the Senate decide to take a job in the Virginia government in order to, where the Democrats might change a seat? Will there be a recount, the recount in Hampton Roads, where Newport News, where there's a 10-vote margin? Will that change? So some degree of uncertainty about what's going to happen there. But what we do know for sure is that things will change because the dynamic now changes overall in Virginia state government. For the last 8 years, we've had the same dynamic. The Democrats controlling the executive branch and the Republicans essentially having an ironclad control of the General Assembly because the House had 66 Republicans. The governor couldn't do anything in which he couldn't get Republican support. The Democrats had enough folks in the Senate to ensure that any kind of social legislation that came out of the House could be vetoed. But that was the dynamic. Now it's different because everything's in flux. It's 21-19. And what does that mean? What does that mean for you? In some instances, I think one of the things that you need to think about is just how many new people overall there are in the House. And I'm not just talking about those 15. VPAP did something this week that showed 47 of the 100 House members have 4 or less years' experience in government. So that's the educational challenge that the business community has. Not just with the 15 new Democrats, it's really with the House overall. There's 47 new people, essentially, in the last 4 years. So it's a continuing thing. I mean, it should be very good for the government relations people. I mean, there are a lot of jobs left here and more activity that needs to get done. But that's something that's a challenge for the business community right now, is to think about all the new people that there are there. Secondly, as Senator Norman alluded to, certainly there's going to be a lot of fairness legislation that will come out of the House, whether it be minimum wage and issues that we've seen about particular companies. But overall, my sense is that that's unlikely to be made into law, because I'm sure it's going to pass the House, and then for sure it's a lot of that's unlikely to pass the Senate. We're going to see that. But there will be some things that are on the table that might not have been on the table previously. I think Medicaid expansion under a different name may well be on the table. Some model that I've seen in the blueprint talking about, let's look at some other states that are sort of conservative states that have accepted some federal dollars. How have they done it? I think that kind of issue is on the table as well. I think redistricting reform could potentially be on the table, and certainly we will see if the Democrats are serious about it. Whether they really wanted it, or whether now that they have a chance of seeing a potential majority, they will accept it. But I think that comes on the table as well. And thirdly, there are going to be some sort of under-the-radar screen issues that will come up, such as making seatbelts in public safety arena a primary offense, something that we didn't see for years, but we could well see that kind of legislation come back. But finally, what I want to say is really at the core of this conference, and that's where do we go on economic development? And one of the things that I've noticed actually over the past 18 months is that despite the partisan fervor in Washington and how partisan this election turned out, was in many instances, what we're seeing in Virginia is a real strong emerging consensus around economic development issues. If you look at this blueprint, you look at Stephen Murray and what he's doing at VEDP, you look at Go Virginia, you look at some of the higher ed issues that we have, that there is really an emerging consensus on a whole set of issues. Workforce development. Everywhere you go, that's what you hear. How are we going to ensure that our students in high school, community college, and universities have better connection to business opportunities? I was privileged to be able to do some interviews in the Go Virginia process this year, both in metro areas and rural areas, and we heard that time and time again. It's what everybody is talking about, workforce development, how that's going to be done. Everybody's talking about how we can collaborate across sectors. How can business, education, nonprofits, how can everybody work together on these issues to address these kind of challenges? So we're seeing that collaboration. Everyone is talking about linking education more closely to job opportunities in businesses, whether it be career and technical education in high schools, or whether it is speaking about what's happening at universities on that front. So, there's a whole set of emerging issues about where we go in terms of economic development, where I think we are seeing a broad consensus emerging. And I think the challenge now with the new legislators is to think about how to message that, how to talk about that. And I think what these people care about more than anything else is sort of improving the quality of life, the quality of communities, making sure that's the focus we have. And I might add, that to me seems to be a perfect place where Governor Northam is really going to be an excellent leader. Because I think his disposition is about collaboration, crossing aisles, trying to find consensus, trying to find the places where Virginians can move forward together. So I think this is just a really appropriate moment to release the blueprint, because my sense is that it is what Dennis described it as. It's a consensus document that really exemplifies and ties together where all of Virginia is moving in terms of economic development. And I think it's important that the message that goes out of here and goes forward is that's how we want to move everybody, regardless of party and regardless of politics. Thanks so much for letting me be here today.